relating to a well-being economy, degrowth, and how to understand a good life in a time of global upheaval. Our speakers explore topics at the intersection of social, nature, and economic justice. They explore how we can build societies where fairness, equality, and livable standards for humans are balanced with land, resource rights, environmental protections, and dignity for all. The talks are live streamed to our social media platforms, and past episodes can be found on the SR Turtle Island webpage in case you're interested in watching prior talks. And now today, we are very excited to introduce today's speaker and a fellow member of Scientist Rebellion, Dr. Marion Grau. Dr. Grau's research is focused on the climate crisis, specifically a political theology of climate activism, climate psychology, and theories of change. She will be sharing insights from the Oslo Degrowth Conference in June of this year, just a few months ago, and the presentation made by her team from Scientist Rebellion, Norway. We welcome Dr. Marion, and please take it from here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here and to share some of the impressions that we received from the Degrowth Conference in Oslo just a while ago. And I wanted to just give a little bit of the context. So it was the Degrowth Conference that was in Oslo, and I think most of the participants were European or some from Global South. And I have some impressions that I've collected, and I think I don't want to spend too much time on it, but just to give the context, I think everybody was agreeing that it was a really great conference in many ways, and especially the opening session where it was stated that degrowth economy or degrowth has to now do what neoliberal economics did decades ago and kind of revolutionize the economic system. And there was a string of colonial, anti-colonial critique going through the entire conference. There were some controversies around sort of northern reformist kind of approaches, and there were all constantly critical voices from the Global South that were voiced, although number of people were saying we could have heard more of that. And there was also kind of a parallel session that some people had attend where they kind of went to kind of discuss some of the Global South concerns or anti-colonial concerns that perhaps were not always represented in the main rooms. But overall, people seem to have thought it was an extremely radical conference on many levels, although there were some critical features. For example, there are a lot of activists that really did not appreciate that Thomas Piketty was invited, and were quite open about sharing that they found him to be not a legitimate speaker because of ethical concerns. That had to do with his personal ethics and some claims for, I'm not quite sure about the specifics, but there was quite a strong resistance against his presence there. So I just wanted to mention that. So that it was not a conference that was always kind of like everybody was fine and good. But I think people went away with some really important impulses and felt that there was some activism there, but it was not enough. People wanted to have more presence of kind of hands-on. It's too much theory. Now we really need to talk about action and hands-on experience and so forth. And so we were invited, or Scientist Rebellion Norway inserted itself into the conference by just proposing a panel with a sexy title that we then sort of made up 2 days before. And this is the presentation, and I'm now presenting. So my colleague Théophile Martin from Scientist Rebellion and I cobbled this together, and we really were meaning this to be kind of a sort of our best impulses on where we are now with civil disobedience or protest actions, a little bit on radical flank effect. And then really, we're using this as a way to crack open a conversation. And I'm hoping that we can do that today as well. So it's going right into the slide presentation and starting with talking about a little bit about how scientists in Scientist Rebellion and elsewhere have perhaps traditionally thought about, or what are the sort of forms of activism that you can think about, and then and you can, many of us started with teaching. We just were doing regular teaching in our classes, and then you have sort of your established academic practices on the lower part here, and then you can have there might be teach-ins, classroom occupations, interruptions of established curricula. You can transform your curricula. You can sort of work within the institution to transform how and what is being taught. There is the research part, so a lot of us have perhaps shifted the focus of our research. I have, for example, said that for the next 10 years of my academic career, I will be focusing exclusively on topics of climate change. And I think many of us have done that in various ways. We can start interdisciplinary dialogue with different sciences, humanities, indigenous peoples, and so forth. We can talk about what regenerative research practices might be. And we could supply scientific support for activism, which I think is also something I'm trying to do myself. And I think many of us might be doing that in various ways. And then there is the whole aspect of outreach, or when scientists kind of like don't just transform their sort of regular habitat of teaching and research, but participate in civil disobedience through road blockades, while posting, academic occupations of corporate and state institutions and so forth. So we might engage in forms of scientific activism. Some of you perhaps participated in the statue blinding and happened a while ago on asking to respect science. So scientists taking more public roles that are not necessarily prescribed within your job description, right? And using academic advocacy to promote climate and ecological action. You can all think about, where do I fit on this, and where do I see myself, and where might be places that I want to do more, and so forth. And it's just sort of that. And then I was thinking about this is from my own sort of thoughts about nonviolent direct action, so NVDA, right? Nonviolent direct action. That when we talk about civil resistance, it often takes the form of nonviolent direct action. But what is direct action? What makes it nonviolent or violent? And those are some, especially as the climate crisis is becoming more sharpens and becomes more violent itself, and the forms of structural violence that climate change actually represent, are upon us more and more. What might we actually have to think more about what is actually nonviolent direction, or what does nonviolent actually mean, and what constitutes violence when we are living in a system of structural violence, right? So nonviolent direct action might be then direct action that is institutional, like a response to institutionalized violence, behaviors of waging conflict against, and methods of protest, non-cooperation and intervention, that is without the use of or threat of force. But there might be a question around what nonviolent actually means. In a class that I've participated in Scientist Rebellion Norway, we talked about the fact that nonviolence is not about, this is from Kazuhaga's book Healing Resistance, Nonviolence is not about what not to do. It is about what you are going to do about the violence and injustice we see in our own hearts, in our homes, in our neighborhoods, and society at large. So it's not about like we live in a we're somehow living in a space that is nonviolent. We live in a space in spaces and in nations that are in fact scenarios of violence. And so the nonviolent action actually is action against that violence rather than not doing anything, right? So so that I for me has been a really clarifying way of thinking what is actually nonviolent. And there might be a way in which, you know, you can nonviolent as a word, and you can put a hyphen in it, and then you know it can be defined as a sort of straight more. So it's not, you know, Gandhi and Martin Luther King said it's not equal pacifism, right? But it's active resistance against systems of violence and oppression. I find that I do not find that in the psychology or the sociologist article. So for myself, I wanted to found it really important to clarify that. And then there's ways to distinguish between principled nonviolence, meaning I'm not using violence because of I believe in love and justice. And there's also strategic nonviolence, which, you know, I hear about a lot in activist circles, like we're not using violence because we will be crushed, you know, we will lose the support of the public and so forth. So that's a more strategic choice to engage in nonviolence. And there's kind of a interesting dynamic where, you know, I think it's useful to think about, you know, what's the principled nonviolence? Does it overlap? Very often it does with the strategic nonviolence. And when might it not, right? And so again, the whole question of what constitutes violence is a very interesting question. And I like really Schumann's graphic here, also about what kind of protests do we have, and thinking whenever we do protests, thinking about who is the audience of this. You know, what is the type of protest? So you can have, you know, just a regular thing all the way to a more disruptive thing. Who is your target audience? You have to think about who's the target audience just to sort of decide. And then what is the outcome one seeks? So thinking somewhat more strategically. I mean, I'm sure some of us do. I haven't been maybe as much, and this graphic really helps me clarify. Oh yeah, what is the type of outcome we seek? What is the target audience? Who is really the target audience of this action? And what kind of form of action do we take? So this is kind of a sort of like just a little bit of a sort of thought piece to kind of stimulate the discussion. And so right, and so for many of us, what reasons to do nonviolent disobedient action might be to gain media attention, which I sometimes are really ambivalent about, because I'm like, who is that media? And is all we do just to get the attention? What's that do to us? What does that do to the movement? It could be, what's happening now? It could be to create economic and political pressure. It could be to use your opponent's strength against them to trigger sympathy. What's going on here? Sorry about that. You can still see my slides, right? Yeah, and then we were going into what are some of the forms of, and we used examples from the Norwegian context to, in part, to look at what are some of the actions that have been happening, and the kind of yeah. So we have the Tesla takedown. We have kind of just a slow march. We have some street occupations. We have statue blinding. We have, you know, active speaking, don't silence the science, and a die-in. So those are some of the ways in which people often, you know, again, it's interesting to think about, okay, so who is the target audience? What is the form of action? What is the outcome we're seeking? Let's see. Yeah, and then we were going a little bit into sort of the Norwegian context because the conference was in Norway, so we wanted to give it a little bit of a Norwegian kind of flavor. And we're reminding people of, I think this is Arne Næss, for those of you who've heard his name, one of the thinking or the important figure in a deep ecology movement at a sort of historic protest against a hydroelectric dam in 1970. And then in the Alta action from 1970 to 1982 that essentially revolved around also a hydroelectric dam that both Sami people and the Norwegian dominant population were together about resisting, and is kind of the sort of history of ecological conflicts or ecological movement in Norway that we have to really remind people of, because in a sort of Norwegian context, Scandinavian context, there is such an assumption that the state and the government is looking out for you, so that civil disobedience is almost like an insult to the state, because, aren't we taking care of you, the nanny state, aren't we providing for your welfare? How do you dare suggest that we do not take care of you? And also another interesting piece is that I still haven't figured out how to deal with is that these are hydroelectric dams that were the first sort of ecological conflicts in Norway. Today, Norway is essentially has its energy, electric energy, primarily from hydroelectric dams. It's one of the few countries that can do that. But today, our context is that while Norway itself gets its energy from a sort of green hydroelectric dams, of course, when you look at this history, they're not green. But today, of course, we're looking at fossil infrastructure, and the fact that Norway was now just called one of the 5 climate wreckers by Oil Change Internationals. It's a little tiny country, but has so much willingness to defy the scientific consensus, and wants to just wants to be the last country to essentially, the last drop of oil, that's going to be Norway, right? And so that's the kind of setting in which we are trying to do activism here. It's quite difficult. So this today, what is the sort of main focus is oil infrastructure. So this is from the Tømmerblok refinery. I think it was somewhere in Oslo. And then we have some pictures from Trondheim, where the sort of main technical university in Norway is, where people were doing street blocks and slow walks and various things, and with various outcomes around whether media paid attention to it or not. And just a word about this university. It is a university that now is providing, and this is always, like I must like listen to the science. It depends on which science and what they're trying to do, because there are scientists that a lot of force and power and money in this university goes to develop deep sea mining and CCS, carbon and capture and storage. So all kinds of, next level green colonialist technologies that are being sold to people as a form of transition, or how to get out of oil. The oil industry is to kind of use the same kind of knowledge that people have with deep sea technology, because all the oil fields are in the North Sea, to use that then to do deep sea mining. And Norway was the first country to say, yes, we're going to do it, and still hasn't moved from that. Right. So that we had talked a little bit about the fact that is there something that are scientists being taken more seriously when they do activism? And for some people, that's a yes, and other. So I don't know how we can discuss this later, how people see that. Is that effect of scientists doing activism, is that still working for people? And Fabian de Blunder was in a session with us, and his argument was that it does make a difference. There is a sense of being taken more seriously when you're a scientist, and you're kind of being pushed into this kind of position of needing to protest in this way rather than just doing your sort of academic labor. So here, another couple pictures. And then we're thinking about a little bit about what is it actually that makes an action successful, right? Because a study of climate change and animal rights movement found that unpopular attacks is what's called a radical flank, and I'm sure many of you know that term, increase public support for moderate faction within the same movement, right? So even though there might be what some call a backlash on this, the sort of group of people that never would have agreed with you anyway, there is often a moderate increase of public support from the same sort of the people who agree with you but may not be as engaged or may not be as active. So other studies though have shown why people may not like the radical flank protesters. So a lot of people really didn't like the tomato soup thing, but everybody knows about it, right? I mean, like if you say Van Gogh and tomato soup can, people know about it, or many, many, many people know exactly what you're talking about. And that is sort of like, is a weird protest, right? It wasn't sort of making sense. So there's a study that says, sort of strange, weird, non-logical protests maybe getting through the sort of media block that climate activism often experience, right? Because apparently it needs to be disruptive. Famously, Roger Helms said, we were masses and masses of people out in the street, nothing in the media, but as soon as you do this kind of action, everybody's like, whoa. So after disruptive climate protests in the UK, the environment emerged among the top 3 public concerns. So there is kind of a way in which it does get lifted up, right? And the authors conclude that people may shoot the messengers, but they do at least sometimes hear the message. And so interesting, some interesting questions to ask is, how do we determine which climate actions to engage in and what to what goal? And I had the good fortune to spend a semester in Princeton last fall and work with psychological researchers, and one of them said to me, if they're not looking to be liked or joined, then the Just Stop Oil actions in the UK were successful. Again, what is successful is not the same as being liked or follow or joined, right? So what are our goals? So it prompted me to think more clearly and more fine-grainedly about what are our goals? How do our particular group's goals change if we see ourselves as part of a wider movement? And how we can say, I feel like now in the situation we are now in terms of the rising authoritarianism and repression in so many countries, like I'm here with activists. I wanted to mention that I'm actually at a monastery right now with a group of about 20 climate activists and 2 therapists from Psychologists for Future. And we have people here who have nightmares about police brutality, and we have people who were beaten. There's like this lady, 75 years old, and she goes with a stick. And I thought it was like something that had to do with her age, but no, she was beaten by security forces and police, and now walks with a limp. So people, are really affected. And so I'm here in a space that is so rare, where somebody sits with us and talks to us and lets us process the sort of emotional and physical labor that goes into radical climate protests. So just to mention that from where I'm speaking right now. So yeah, let's see. Interesting for me is the radical flank effect. Is it the whole question of backlash or multiple audiences and effects, right? Who is your audience again? Because there's often a lot of people that's really worried about backlash. And a lot of studies though say, okay, so if when factor in people's political leanings to begin with, you're not going to be surprised that the people who produce a backlash are people already not agreeing with you or don't want to hear from you to begin with, right? So the multiple ad audiences is a really interesting thing that for me and others, I think is really important to look at. So when movements lose traction and a perception of failure spreads, right, radical flank can emerge that strategically provokes aiming to recharge the movement. And I'm always thinking, where are we now? Where are we now? Because I feel like a lot of activists right now are in a space of weightlessness and don't quite know what this moment is and what comes next. At least here in Europe, and really interested to hear very soon from people about where you guys are. And so radical flank movements can be leading edge, shifting conversations, but now in a sort of more repressive regime, under more repressive regimes, what happens with that? More moderate groups can move into the space, right, opened and gain followers who agree with the cause, and we see this here. We had Greta Thunberg um, in Norway last year, and blocking a hotel where new oil licenses were helping to block a hotel with new oil licenses for Norwegian oil industry were being distributed, and next day, article in the Norwegian press was like, I really don't like Greta Thunberg's methods, but of course she's right. And that's kind of like, I was like, bam, bingo, this is the radical flank effect. It gave him the opportunity to agree that she's right, even though he sort of like disavowed the sort of methods. And that's an interesting thing that we just keep finding in our personal experience also. So climate emergency fund, of course, right, funds only disruptive action groups. So we have few donor foundations to support who actually support disruptive process. So that's an interesting thing to think about. How are we resourcing our movements? So the news articles on the radical flank effect have tended to focus on the backlash side of things, neglecting the fact that all protests have a split response. There is both a positive radical flank effect and there is a backlash radical flank effect. And I think that knowing that going into an action, sort of knowing that and accepting that it's going to be like that, not everybody's going to love and appreciate. So again, then thinking about that, what does that do? Knowing that, how to plan and execute actions. There seems to be, as far as I could find, no evidence that protests hurt the cause, as the research does not bear that out. It does subtly increase support from more moderate groups, right? That's the radical flank effect. Then we'll move on a little bit more because this is a very detailed slide. And then, yeah, just quickly talking about, so this is an action that happened before we gave the day before the presentation, and this is a group of us created out of a moment of whimsiness this sort of version of Edward Monk's Scream, with an oil platform in the North Sea, right, behind us, and then descended upon the Munch Museum with t-shirts with this imprinted upon in this dark room where the actual three of the copies are of that artwork. It in some ways completely failed because as you can see, the room is very dark, and so all we have is a few pictures. But one of the activists was actually using the poem that Munch inspired Munch, or that he wrote, and that inspired the artwork, and kind of just recited it amongst a throng of tourists. It was very funny in many ways. And we also stood in front of the wrong painting because they sort of rotate which painting they show. So it was sort of, we used it as a kind of like, was this a good action? Is this action successful? Was it not successful? Because the only good pictures that we could get of us screaming in front of the screen with that image of the oil platform is outside the museum, and we got no press coverage whatsoever. But it was also it was incredibly bonding, and we created now a piece of art that I think we want to keep using in our upcoming actions. We actually have we're planning actions August 12th to 22nd against Norwegian oil, and in the run-up for the big election now in the fall. And then just quickly, there's another, this was just sort of like to start the conversation. So there's a few people at the conference that arranged Divest Now action. So because they wanted to get the scholars to actually show up for a protest in front of the Norwegian bank, no, wait, the finance ministry. And so this was one of the days of the conference, and so it was trying to integrate the conference with a protest, right? Because this is what's going on. They're funding Israeli occupied, the Wealth Fund is investing in oil, right? It's like fossil fuel investment invested in Israeli occupied Palestinian territories. And here is, some pictures of some of us blocking the Norwegian main bank that manages this fund. And then, I'm just going to skip through this. And this was the group of scholars from the conference and some local activists that showed up at the finance department one of the days of the conference. And that is actually it from me, and would like to just invite to open the conversation. So back to you, Bethany.
Thank you, Marion. That was so interesting. I saw a familiar article. The Forbes article was written by our friend Marion Krasny at Cornell. And yeah, thank you for providing so much territory in one talk. I see there is one question in the chat, so I'll start with that question and then we'll open it up to whomever would like to pose their own questions. So Troy, I will read this question for you from the chat. With the increasing repression to activists, what do you think about the legal concept of climate necessity defense as a tool for educating the public and the courts, and also as a potential protection for people willing to risk arrest?
Not being a legal scholar, I've heard a little bit about it, and I think it's a fantastic idea. The question is, where, in which country and context is that being accepted, or where can you actually bring that into the courtroom? I think I've heard it somewhere in Europe. I think that's being used, maybe the UK. I might be wrong about that. I think it's a fantastic idea, but it's a little bit like personal rights for a river. It's nice to have, but can it actually be actualized? Will it actually be respected? Because I think one of the reasons why a lot of climate activists really, one of the aspects of the overlap with the Palestine and Gaza situation is because we have clear legal, we have clarity from the UN about, war crimes, genocide, and things not to do in general towards other humans, and governments are not acting, they're not resisting. So I guess what I'm saying is I think it's a great idea, and I don't know how it would be enforced, frankly. I don't think I know that much more about it. I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
Thank you. Troy, feel free to respond if you had a thought. Otherwise, if anyone else has questions, please raise your hand. I see Margaret has a question, so I will turn there. Feel free to go ahead, Margaret.
Okay. I actually have a couple of comments on the necessity defense. And I've been following and been a supporter of our Children's Trust. And I also got arrested blockading natural gas methane infrastructure. And two other elders and myself were going to claim necessity defense. And so they dismissed our charges. The court didn't want to deal with it. But more importantly, when my daughter, who was an environmental lawyer in Australia, was being accepted into the bar, whatever the thing was in Australia, the judge who spoke was speaking about parallels between human rights law and environmental law, and that in Australia and the United States and Britain, all their everything legal goes back to British common law, and anything that isn't in your constitution is based on case precedent. And human rights, especially international human rights, rights for people who are not legal citizens of a country, and environmental law don't have much precedent. And that's where cases like the necessity defense create precedent. And what she said is any one case is going to lose. But the more cases that get filed, the more, and this was back in 2004, the more cases that get brought, the more decisions that get made, that will start to create the precedents. And indeed, that's what's happened with our Children's Trust. Now, our Children's Trust has started partially winning cases where in a state where the Constitution of that state has rights to a healthy environment. So the needle is being moved by these cases. But Marion's point about the governments, even when the governments lose a case, they do nothing. By itself, necessity defenses get you nowhere. It's when combined with things like divestment, something else I've been involved with, gets you nowhere. And, you know, it's like the stocks just get sold to somebody else. The companies don't go out of business. But it starts a conversation. It brings people in. And then when you explain to them, you know, what you did was good, but it isn't enough. You have to do more. We have to do many, many, many things. Some of these things are good at drawing people in, like divestment. Some of them, like necessity defense, are good at actually laying the groundwork for success in the future. But the success in the future is only going to happen when who's in charge of governments change. And I've been an activist for a long, long time and lived in Sweden in '68 and really agree with everything Marion said in terms of things that have worked and things that haven't. Bethany's heard a lot of my history, but I really appreciate Marion's presentation because it echoes my experience. So thank you.
Thank you. Can I just say one quick thing in response to that? You know, we have so many cases. You'd think Norway would respect its citizens' rights, but we have a case where the Sami community got, you know, the Supreme Court agreed with the Sami against a wind park that was built without permission, and they said it's illegal, right? But nothing has happened. The government has done absolutely nothing. So one of the real dilemmas for the Sami community, the indigenous community in you know, Scandinavia, Norway in particular here, is that they feel like there's a truth and reconciliation process that the Norwegian government wants to try to, you know, like claim they engage in, and at the same time they disrespect their own Supreme Court. So the Sami are like, so it doesn't even matter if we win in the Supreme Court because nothing happened. So the wind park stands. Nobody has made any move to dismantle it or to bring any kind of change to the insult and injury that green colonialism now is, right? So just quickly, so and onwards, yes.
Thank you, Marion. That's, yeah, incredibly frustrating to hear. Suzanne, I see your hand up, and then after Suzanne, Troy.
Yeah, thank you, Marion. It was very powerful. And I'm glad you mentioned the Sami, because I was thinking about the comparison between Canada and Norway. Both are countries that are perceived as being very green, that they take care of their people, that, healthcare, all these things. And of course, that's only a very, very small part of the picture. The reality is that both of our countries are petrostates that are absolutely intent on and are actively massively increasing fossil fuel production, and also mining in other countries. And so I was actually curious about the issue of Indigenous rights, because we have a very parallel here with our First Nations people, and just a horrific history, and the issue of truth and reconciliation. And how, as activists, how can we engage on this issue and support the Indigenous activism and the Indigenous fight for the land that is truly theirs?
So hard, like, and I'm in a dilemma right now. I'm not in Norway, and we're preparing for massive, big actions, those 2 weeks of actions that are around fossil fuel industry. Meanwhile, at the same time, in the north of Norway, during the summer break, a mining case that indigenous Sami won in what's called a Repparfjord, in a fjord very in far north. We thought we had actually won that and won the case. The company was shut down. The company went out of business that wanted to build this mine. Now, what has happened is that an American company has bought this company, this defunct company, and they're now pushing it through. And they started digging without having permission, as happens so often. They just go and start digging, and while everybody's in summer vacation, right? And the Sami are now having to sit there and try to occupy the mine, and they did it. They were in the mine. Got actually inside, but they're now have been cleared out. And I feel like I should be there too, right? So and we're completely outnumbered. And what can you do when legal precedent, is just not being respected? And so it really feels quite desperate. And this is a country that supposedly respects the rule of law, right? This isn't the US. This is Norway, right? So it's just like, yeah, I think there are very many parallels there for sure. The sort of like perception, the external perception that both Canada and Norway, I think, kind of use to their advantage sometimes in order to kind of get away with murder, and it's a very sort of schizophrenic and very yeah. There's another face that is very ugly. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Troy.
Yeah, just to respond to your question, back to me, that in the United States, almost every state does allow a necessity defense. In my case, I was arrested twice over the last few years, and was able to put forth a necessity defense. And in both the cases, it was dismissed just the day before trial, because the prosecutor felt they probably were going to lose. So it is something that's available. Dismissals are still a victory. And so it might be something for all of us to educate ourselves about a little. Thanks, Jack. Thank you very much for what you're bringing forward to Jack.
Thanks, Troy. Does anyone else have a question? Well, people are thinking, I have one question for you, Marion. You mentioned at one point that you told the story of your action in Norway with the t-shirts in front of the Scream. And you said it didn't get press coverage and you're not sure how successful it was, but it definitely achieved bonding among the activists.
Yes.
And I just attended a different discussion led by a scholar of nonviolent direct action, a philosopher, and she argued, I mean, there was a lot of jargon, but her main point was that what defines nonviolent direct action is the felt experience of taking power into your own hands. And so she argued that I think her argument is that the main benefit of NVDA is bonding among the activists through that shared collective experience of power. And she argued that direct action must be collective, not individual, I think for that reason. So what do you think of that?
I think I have come to a similar conclusion and did have a conversation with a SR Turtle Island person, may or may not be the same person, I don't know, who said essentially protests are about asserting your values and asserting your sense of agency and your sense of community with the other activists, right? So that is the primary, and people may find that that's not enough, but I actually think, especially like I'm not in the US right now, but I can imagine even going out to a protest and getting out and daring to stand up, daring to be out there in a context that really now is becoming more and more repressive, has got to be a victory in itself. So I do think that is absolutely true, and I think when we did this class on sort of nonviolence with Kazu Haga's book, and I had heard many things about the civil rights movement, but they gave us a perspective on it that I really hadn't thought about it. Like we all know about Rosa Parks and all of that, and I just hadn't realized or had forgotten or had sort of blocked out the fact that there were years, if not decades, of bus protests before that she was not, she wasn't, we sort of know she wasn't an organizer, that I had figured out, she wasn't a random person. But I really learned the history of the civil rights movement in the sense that like how long it took for the events that we remember now to actually come to a fruition. The long process of that over years and decades and the invisible work that is behind that, I think I just hadn't really seen. And so this sort of and again, what is the expectation? What is the outcome I expect? Is it to, be non-compliant, to assert my own self-determination, right? So psychologists talk about self-determination theory. So one of the ways is to just really like resist what the sort of society wants you to do and just stand up and be counted. That in itself, and to do that together with other activists, it's absolutely a prime, if nothing else, that's what you have achieved during a protest. I would say that is the minimum. Now, I'm sure there are people who would say, well, that's sort of, it's just for ourselves. That's kind of narcissistic. It's, that's not enough. We really need to have, agency beyond that. But I think, all the stuff that I'm reading now, I feel like this is not an exact science. This is trial error. This is moving on and on and on, just keeping on and trying what works. And a lot of the movements that seem to have had a breakthrough, it was sort of in a way sort of like, why did this work and not that? And they don't necessarily have a great explanation for that. So I think we just success is not always, success as in media breakthrough or policy breakthrough is not always the measure of things. But so we're in a period right now where I feel like we're so down in spirits, the activist community, where we don't quite know what's next, where we feel defeated on every front. I mean, one of my co-activists got a summons to appear before court because he has been accused of psychological participation in a roadblock because he sat in a car that later was used in a roadblock. This kind of level of crazy, right? Where there is kind of like there's these like blown up charges that are similar to what, Hallam is sitting in prison for attending a Zoom call. Maybe I'll be, sitting a few years from now for doing this Zoom call, who knows? But so it's like there's kind of a sense of, if nothing else, we can stand up for ourselves, and while we figure out something else. I don't know, it doesn't sound very satisfying to me to say that, but I think that is part of the truth, for me at least. Yeah.
Thank you. Troy, I see you had your hand up and then you put something in the chat. Would you like to pose the question yourself?
Sure. Let me just get it there again. What targets do you feel are the most vulnerable for us to do actions on Turtle Island?
I feel like that as a question I want to throw back at you guys that are I want to actually hear a little bit about what people might know about what's going on with actions. And as Suzanne and I talked a little bit about this in terms of ICE, in terms of sort of kind of, is there something, because another theory that's very interesting on this is the fact that repression very often leads to the opposite. People will rise up, or at least, more people, because the repression becomes so ridiculous, right? Right now in Scotland and in the UK, people get arrested and charged for up to like 14 years of prison. I don't know if that's going to happen, but for sitting down with a sign that says, I don't support genocide, Palestine action. That's the level of crazy we've gotten to inform in terms of, and I think that what Chenoweth and others are saying, when you get that level of weird, crazy kind of charges, then more people will actually there will be a kind of backlash to the repression. So I don't know. I'd actually love to hear from you. I mean, I see activists out there doing quite wild actions in a context where I feel like, wow, that feels really dangerous. That feels scary. So I'd love to actually also just hear from people in Turtle Island, where I'm not currently. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I'm always a little biased towards going after fossil fuel and appreciate ICE and all these other issues, which are equally important. But I feel that as scientists and as we bring a particular knowledge about the climate crisis that is really where we can be most effective and do the most good. So I chained myself to Wells Fargo Bank branch because they invest so much in fossil fuels. And that again gets back to climate necessity defense. And I'm not trying to focus on that entirely, but that if we do actions that are that we can then go to court and say, this is what I had to do, the harm I caused is less than what is happening. I've tried all the other avenues. So, we seem to not be, it's hard to attack Exxon because what do? You get them to stop business. But so there's so many targets that it's difficult. And I was hoping you might have some incentives or ideas as to what the most effective would be.
Right.
Not necessarily here, but also in Europe.
Right. I don't dare say, because I feel like it's very, very hard to tell. I feel like in Norway, at least, there's kind of a coalescence between the Palestine movement and Extinction Rebellion, which, because Scientist Rebellion in Oslo is very small, so I'm mostly with Extinction Rebellion. So we are kind of trying to collaborate because we're also thinking about what increases the movement, so thinking that Scientist Rebellion is maybe part of a larger movement. I think it's also a question of, who do we target in terms of how do we, is there a way in which we can grow, and what does that mean in terms of collaborating? And so, and also now we in Norway again, because that's my primary context. We have a little group now finally of scientists in Oslo, and what we're trying to do is to chip away at what we call the Norwegian oil myth. So these narratives about how we will have no social welfare state without oil. There will be no healthcare. There will be no pension. It's basically we have the greenest oil in the world, and Europe needs our democratic and green gas because because of Russia. And so so I think scientists in my understanding can be helpful at providing ammunition. So we're trying to create fact sheets for people who have grown up with these myths and that hear them from the media and from politicians every day, to try to counteract narratives. I think that's one thing scientists who work with narratives and try to provide facts on to counter the sort of logic of why we need oil expansion. But I see other questions in the chat, so maybe we should move on. Do people protest billionaires in Norway? Nope, because they're all in Switzerland, and they're don't want to pay taxes in Norway. No, not all of them, but no, we're way too polite. I wish we had climate defiance here. I think we might. So when we have our action period, we're going to this very fancy political festival in a town called Arendal, and I think they will try to basically flood the zone with protesters in some of these discussions, and then I don't know quite what fellow activists will do, but they will try to make people really, really uncomfortable. Billionaires not are present at these oil conferences and so forth, so they are, but not, and I think Greenpeace Norway actually dumped some flood debris on the balcony of an oil executive, which was an amazing action. But it's so far in that. Yes, and Bethany, do you want to take it?
Sure. Yeah. This is fascinating. We have 3 minutes to the top of the hour, but Marion said that she could stay later, and Suzanne can also continue hosting if you want to stay on past the hour. I do want to note, as we continue the discussion, keep in mind that we're having another call like this next month with Paul Morris. So he will be speaking also about degrowth, but a different set of topics, which I just put in the chat. So because the series is about Buen, Vivir, and degrowth, and how to make a difference through our activism, I think Margaret's question seems really relevant. I'll read it here, since just in the interest of time. So Margaret asks, how can we make degrowth so appealing to so many people that corporations are forced into more ecological practices and or just giving up on certain products and processes? She says, isolated vanguards are too isolated. We need bridge groups that people can relate to. I see NVDA as a bridge activity, but we need many, many bridges to make differences soon enough.
Absolutely. Wow, that's a big, big question. We had actually a session just before I came here that was called, where we had a challenge where, imagining if we make it through this, Joanna Macy, of blessed memory now, the sort of, if we make it through the collapse, and we kind of find this alternative solution, this alternative society, how did we get there? And so people were then challenged to write and discuss in small groups, what did we do to help us get there? For me, I think it really is important to provide alternatives for the labor. So many people are stuck in bullshit jobs. They need alternatives. They need to, when we talk about climate, activists are angry and are enraged about, the freedom that is taken from us through climate change. I think the rage is also on quote unquote the other side, or there's a lot of people being enraged because identities and existences feel threatened on all levels. And is there a way we can engage with that fear, that rage, that insecurity, that sense of my identity and my life is threatened, and provide people with exit strategies? I think that is super important to provide alternative forms of existence, solidarity, and just kind of like what works in your context. I think it's a huge question. I don't have, like it feels way too big for my for one person to even but I do think, yes, I think NVDA is a bridge activity, but we also, I think more and more activists are also thinking about, okay, what is our job in we are a group, we have shared values. If and when a collapse comes, how are we participating in the transformation as a collective? What are the values we bring to it? What are the practices we bring to it? What are the narratives and ideas that we have that actually motivate our actions, and that our actions try to call more people to engage with? I don't know, that feels really unsatisfactory, but I think it's what I got right now.
Suzanne, I will hand it to you to host. I just had one question, but I'll put it in the chat in case we don't have time to cover it.
Well, why don't you ask your question and we'll make this the last one.
Sounds good. So this goes to Troy's earlier, or someone's earlier question about targets, who are the best targets. And I just have this feeling that universities are a good target because they're not fossil fuels. They should distance themselves from fossil fuels. And scientists who are rebelling, it seems like at the very least, they might expect their employers to follow the science because their employers say that's their mission. So I wonder if you see that as a helpful target, both from the point of view of scientists targeting their own employers, and also because there could be strategic leverage to the extent that universities could actually change their business model and break with fossil fuels. Maybe they would do that, whereas you're not going to get a fossil fuel company to just go bankrupt.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a lot harder, a lot easier for somebody like me who is in sort of social science humanities to say that to my sort of institution. So if I compare my institution or a humanities, based institution with the University of Sciences, which gets funding, right, to develop certain technologies that are extractive. I think we have to really talk about the funding, and I know that there's been activism on that. Our funding comes from the state and not directly from corporations, but the state also in some ways pushes these kinds of forms of extraction. So I think it's super complicated, and I think you have to sort of build capacity from below, because when I tried to push my institution, immediately there were people on the other side who were like, no, we can't do this. So I think building a really forceful group within institutions to kind of then leverage that and most likely work together with student groups if possible, right? And I think it will really depend on your institution. I think some institutions that is possible. Defunding and getting the endowment out of fossil fuels and so forth, and other places, I think it will be very difficult. But yeah, targeting, if you're not contingent faculty, right? If you are, so job security will of course. So I think bundling forces, as far as I've heard, there is a coalition now of colleges and universities that stand up to the sort of anti-DEI policies of the Trump administration. Is that is there something that could be done through these kinds of alliances where groups of colleges and universities could actually work on that together? That seems perhaps a promising avenue. I really don't know. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you for brainstorming with us on that.
Right.
All right, so we haven't gotten to all the questions in the chat, but I'm sure Marion would be open to emails in case anyone wants to follow up. And Marion, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts, for even carving out time in the middle of a meditation retreat to be with us on Zoom.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And it's really thanks for having me. And it's a summer break, and so keeping alive this conversation is really central to us all remaining engaged and with this labor that I think will be continuing for many years forward. And great meeting some of you and seeing some of you again. And I hope to see you in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
you.
And thanks to everyone for joining as well.
Right.
Take care, everyone. Thank you, Marion.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.